Ken Greenberg, our guest, he's an architect and urban designer. He's written a book called Walking Home, which is a lot of history and your experience around the world rebuilding cities, really, revitalizing cities. Somebody who mentored you, in a sense, someone you admired greatly, Jane Jacobs. Tell me about her.
Well, first of all, I was extremely lucky. I moved to Toronto in 1968 within a few months of when she had arrived. I was an architecture student at U of T, and I was working on something to do with cities. I had been inspired by her, so I called her and said, can I see you and have what we call a crit? Can I have a review of what I'm doing? And
Right.
She was so generous. She agreed to do it. So I met her as a student, and she gave me great counsel, and we became lifelong friends until her death. And even when I was director of architecture and urban design for the city of Toronto, I would call on her now and then, go to her house on Albany Avenue and say, Jane, this is what I'm working on. Can I try a few ideas out on you?
Yes, and you have read all of her books, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
The Death and Life of Great American Cities. What was the first one?
That was the first one.
Was that the first one?
Yes.
And then there was one, Dark Age Ahead.
Dark Age Ahead was one of the later ones. And this was really her, even though it has a very dark title, the conclusion is not dark. It's really saying, unless you do certain significant things, the challenges that I write about in effect, you can expect a dark age ahead. So it was kind of a cautionary tale. It was a warning. And she spoke in such an interesting way to big changes that were on the horizon. And one of them that I talk about is she writes about the suburbs, which she hadn't done so much previously. And she, before the subprime crisis, she anticipated that there would be some kind of force majeure, there would be some major circumstance that would cause people to break out of the straitjacket of the suburbs. And she hypothesized what would happen when the economy would dictate such a change. And lo and behold, that's what's happening. And it's driven, among other things, by the cost of energy.
Yes.
So, as gas prices go up and up, people are adapting already. They're making changes, and that will continue to happen.
Well, she was way ahead of her time and predicted that we'd have high energy costs. I don't know if she predicted climate change, but she did always suggest that we should have mixed neighborhoods and front porches. And I think she once said to me, too, the little green strip that used to run in the driveway, you had two pieces of cement and then a green strip in the middle. She said, why not? Why do we have to have a fully paved driveway? Driveway.
I hadn't heard that one, but that's so like her, to be able to look at those really small things and see how they make a difference.
Sure, the devil's in the details. Take me to the cities you've been to, the cities that inspire you, perhaps where people have left the burbs, come into the city, and everybody can't leave the suburbs. That's not the idea.
No, it's the suburbs themselves changing too. I really keep making this point. No, we're not going to abandon where most North Americans actually live now, which in suburbs. So
Right.
those suburbs and the smart suburbs with great leaders like Hazel McCallion in Mississauga, one of our longest term mayors, are actually saying, we've done that. Now we have to make the shift and do something else. But some of the places that have most impressed me recently are the Scandinavian cities of Copenhagen, Stockholm, even Malmo, which was kind of an industrial wasteland in Sweden. And Malmo, this is a really good story. They've joined up with Copenhagen across this very big strait, a national border, and created this fantastic bridge with public transit so that the two cities are actually working together as a unit. People live or work in one or the other, and they both benefit. It's a great case of using something to mutual advantage.
Well, those cities make you want to walk the city.
Increasingly so.
You know what I mean.
Jane made the observation, and it's so true, it's not the distance, it's the experience. So everyone will go to Manhattan and walk incredible distances, and yet I was in Calgary for the last few days, and I saw so many of the new suburbs where you have these big shopping malls and you have people living right beside them, and there's a tiny little path which you could fight your way across the big arteries and go buy your groceries, but no one is, because no one is doing that. The walk is just so awful.
And so if you make the walk prettier, that helps. But you've got these vast parking lots, car to car to car, and not so pretty shopping centers. Some are quite
The
okay
parking
now.
lots are, on the one hand, the current problem, but they are the great opportunity. And in
How
places
so?
like Mississauga, they're colonizing the parking lots. That's where the new urban blocks are sprouting up as they move the parking into structure, as they introduce public transit, as they put uses closer together. So you have this vast terrain of land in the form of these huge surface parking lots. I'm working with York University on a master plan outside Toronto. They have added 40% to their student body, and they've lost a third of their parking. They've gone from 12,000 to 8,000 parking spaces, and a subway is going to open in 2015. So those parking lots are the place where, surrounding York, they're going to add 50,000 new residents and employees on land surrounding the campus, making it part of an urban neighborhood. And that's the kind of change that's happening in suburb after suburb.
Sure. And it makes sense to integrate the campus into the city rather than isolate the campus. You write about that in here.
No, campuses or universities are getting away from the idea of being isolated from their surrounding cities. So you have extreme examples like Ryerson in the heart of downtown Toronto that had no land at all, that is co-venturing with partners, or Boston University, where I'm currently working, where something similar is happening. And then universities like York that have these vast expanses of land are bringing the city into them.
We can't say Boston today.
Ah,
You know, I mean, well, we can.
Okay.
We can say beat Boston. But
Fair enough.
But Boston, great city, lots of heritage.
Lots of heritage in the inner city, and yet Boston, like every other city we can talk about, when you get to the outer edges, there's a terrible sameness. You can hardly tell which city you're in, although the inner parts are so different.
The terrible sameness is pretty terrible, I have to say.
It is, it is. And I begin my book with an imaginary walk out of the city. It's a walk that we don't take, but just tracing what it would feel like as a human being, trying to be on sidewalks, and eventually they disappear as you go through the rings of time in the decades after World War II, and you get out into these wastelands.
Sure. How would you fix Los Angeles? Some of it is fixed, but how would you fix a city so dependent on freeways, cars?
Well, it happens incrementally, and it happens in pockets. It's not a kind of pervasive layer that suddenly changes everything. And you find either building on historic pieces, obsolescent infrastructure, buildings that get recycled. One of my former teachers who was at UCLA talked about urban mulch, that actually decay, as in nature, becomes something out of which new things grow. And he was talking about Los Angeles specifically. And that you find this interesting phenomenon in all these cities. Sometimes it's, for example, in the strip plazas, you often find that's where the new immigrants are arriving in these semi-abandoned places and creating all these new businesses and new enterprises. A lot of artists actually end up occupying buildings in industrial areas and doing the same thing. So you have to look really carefully for those seeds, those little buds or signs of life,
Sure.
and nurture them.
Are you a fan of gentrification, as it's called, or not?
Gentrification is a funny word. What it's really saying is that people who have more means are choosing urban life. That's not something you can easily stop. It becomes most difficult in cities where they all pile on in a few neighborhoods and they rapidly drive out the previous residents. But it's happening everywhere. And what we're seeing is that the poor in North American cities, as they already are in European cities, are being driven out of the city center, out to the edges. And we have to do something to deal with that. We have to have a national housing policy in Canada, which we don't have. But we also have to look really hard at the hidden subsidies where we as taxpayers are paying for greenfields development at very high rates for all the big roads and highways and the big pipes, rather than making it affordable for people of all incomes to live in urban areas.
Well, and mixed social housing is certainly viable. Some are for it, some against it. There's something magic to me about Vancouver's Chinatown, we have like the Rene Contemporary Gallery and a new pizzeria that's very trendy, shishi. And then we have the barber who's been there for 50 years
Yeah.
with all, so you've got all the tradition and the rich and the poor and the trendy, and it's vibrant. It's great.
Absolutely. That mix of things is so important. Kids have to see where people work. You have to see other kinds of people, and you have to cross them on the sidewalk and meet their eyeballs. And in those homogeneous suburbs, that just doesn't happen. But let me just say one really clever thing that Vancouver has done recently, which is allowing laneway housing everywhere in the city, allowing people to create those rental units at no public cost and do it over such large areas and distribute more people, not in very concentrated clusters, but over the whole city, is a brilliant move in terms of releasing energy in a very clever way, using what you have, which is the cornerstone of sustainability.
Sure, and if the mother-in-law wants to move in, great.
Or a student, or any young person.
But the whole idea of bringing family together in a compound, how great is that?
Absolutely, absolutely. And we have to find those ways of looking at all these regulations that we've tied around ourselves, hamstringing our ability to do those kind of creative things. And many times just applying sunset provisions to existing bylaws without money being added can do incredible things in terms of promoting good change.
What do you want us to take home from walking home? What's the message?
The message is that the change we're just beginning to experience now is as big as the change as I experienced in my early childhood after World War II. It's an exciting change, and life is going to be more interesting and better as it goes forward.
Yes, and when we age a little more, we want a nice place to hang out.
Absolutely.
Nice to meet you. Thank you. Ken Greenberg, Walking Home, The Life and Lessons of a City Builder.